You don't understand anything." 70-year-old Edward Thompson's voice shook with frustration as he faced his 25-year-old grandson Jake across the Memphis Community Center. His weathered hands trembled not just from age, but from the emotional weight of watching his family fall apart. "Your generation has no respect," Jake fired back, his fists clenched, his face flushed with anger that had been building for months. "And your generation is stuck in the past." Elvis Presley had been visiting the Riverside Senior Center that Tuesday afternoon, delivering his monthly donation and spending time with residents who reminded him of his own grandfather. But the shouting from the recreation room stopped him cold in the hallway. This wasn't just an argument. This was a family tearing itself apart, and time was running out to put it back together. Edward Thompson was dying. The doctors at Riverside General had been clear. His weak heart couldn't handle much more stress, and every argument with Jake was literally taking years off his already limited time. Jake Thompson was lost, drowning in a world that seemed to demand everything his grandfather's generation had never faced, while carrying the weight of being the only family Edward had left. "I raised you when your parents couldn't." Edward's voice cracked as he gripped the back of a folding chair for support. "I worked 3 jobs to put food on your table, and this is the respect I get." Jake's response cut through the air like a blade. "I never asked you to sacrifice everything. Maybe if you'd let me make my own choices instead of trying to control my entire life, we wouldn't be here." Elvis watched from the doorway as Edward's face went pale, one hand moving instinctively to his chest. The old man's breathing became labored, but his pride wouldn't let him show weakness in front of his grandson. Jake, seeing his grandfather's distress but misreading it as manipulation, turned toward the exit. "I'm done with this conversation. Don't you walk away from me." Edward's shout echoed off the community center walls, but Jake was already pushing through the double doors into the Memphis heat. Elvis followed at a distance, watching as Jake kicked a trash can in the parking lot, his anger giving way to something that looked more like despair. Inside, Edward collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. 45 years I've been trying to reach that boy," he whispered to the empty room. 45 years and I still don't know how." Elvis approached slowly, recognizing the universal language of heartbreak that transcends age, fame, or circumstance. "Afternoon, Mr. Thompson," he said quietly. "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" Edward looked up, squinting through his glasses. "You're that singer fellow, Elvis something." His voice was hoarse from shouting. "What brings a famous man to our little community center?" "Same thing that brings anyone anywhere that matters," Elvis replied, taking the seat beside him. "Looking for ways to help people who need it." Outside, Jake sat in his beat-up Honda Civic, staring at his phone but not really seeing it. His thumb hovered over his girlfriend's contact, wanting to call her but knowing she'd just tell him what she always did. "You need to make peace with your grandfather before it's too late." Too late. The words echoed in his mind as he remembered the doctor's appointment 3 months ago that had started all of this. Edward's cardiologist had used phrases like significant decline and limited time frame. But Jake had been too angry about Edward's refusal to slow down, his stubborn insistence on maintaining independence despite his failing health. Back inside, Elvis listened as Edward's story poured out like water through a broken dam. How Jake's parents had died in a car accident when the boy was 7. How Edward had given up his retirement plans, his social life, even his dreams of traveling with his late wife Dorothy, to raise a grandson who seemed determined to reject everything Edward tried to teach him. "He thinks I don't understand his world," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Computers, social media, all these newfangled ways of doing things. But I understand more than he thinks. I understand that he's scared, just like I was scared when I suddenly had to be a father again at 55. Elvis nodded thoughtfully. "What is it you and Jake used to enjoy doing together?" Before the argument started, Edward's face softened for the first time all afternoon. "Music. That boy has the most beautiful voice you ever heard." We used to sing together every Sunday morning while Dorothy made pancakes. Old songs mostly. Hymns, folk tunes, some of your music too if I'm being honest. When did that stop? When he got to high school. Suddenly singing with his old grandfather wasn't cool anymore. I tried to understand, but Edward's voice trailed off. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I should have just let him find his own way. The conversation between Edward and Elvis deepened as afternoon shadows lengthened across the community center floor. Edward shared details about Jake's childhood that painted a picture of a bright, sensitive boy who had lost his parents at the worst possible age. Old enough to understand the permanence of death, but too young to process the grief in healthy ways. Jake was angry for a long time after the accident, Edward explained, his voice growing quieter as he relived painful memories. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares, refuse to eat, wouldn't let anyone get close to him. The school counselors said it was normal grief behavior, but it went on for years. Elvis listened intently, understanding now that the current conflict between Edward and Jake had roots that went much deeper than generational differences. How did you help him through that? Music, Edward said simply. It was the only thing that seemed to calm him down. I'd sit by his bed and sing to him when he couldn't sleep. Dorothy would play the piano while we sang together. Gradually, over months and years, the music helped him process the pain in ways that talking couldn't. This revelation cast their current estrangement in an entirely different light. Music hadn't just been a shared hobby between Edward and Jake. It had been Jake's primary therapy for dealing with the trauma of losing his parents. When Jake stopped singing with Edward during his teenage years, he had essentially abandoned the one tool that had helped him heal from his deepest wounds. Maybe, Elvis suggested carefully, Jake stopped singing with you not because he outgrew it, but because it reminded him of his parents' death. Sometimes people avoid the things that help them most when those same things carry painful associations. Edward's eyes filled with understanding. You think he associated our singing with grief? Could be. Or maybe he was trying to prove to himself that he didn't need the comfort anymore. Teenagers do that sometimes, reject the things that make them feel safe because they want to feel grown up and independent. Meanwhile, Jake was having his own moment of clarity in the parking lot. His girlfriend Sarah had arrived at the community center after receiving his emotional phone call, and she was helping him process the argument with his grandfather from a different perspective. Jake, Sarah said gently, what exactly are you and your grandfather fighting about? Not the surface stuff, the real issues underneath. Jake thought for a long moment, his anger finally cooling enough to allow for reflection. I guess I feel like he doesn't trust me to make my own decisions. Like he thinks I'm still that scared little kid who needed him to take care of everything. And how does that make you feel? Like I'm failing him. Like no matter what I accomplish or how independent I become, he'll always see me as someone who needs to be managed and protected. Jake's voice cracked slightly. But the worst part is that sometimes I do still feel like that scared kid. Sometimes I do want him to take care of everything. Because adult life is overwhelming and I don't know what I'm doing. Sarah nodded understanding. So you're angry at him for treating you like a child. But you're also angry at yourself for sometimes wanting to be treated like a child. The observation hit home with painful accuracy. Jake realized that his anger toward Edward was partly displaced anger toward himself. Frustration with his own need for security and guidance in a world that seemed to demand complete self-reliance from 25-year-olds. He raised me to be independent and strong, Jake continued. But then when I try to be those things, he panics and tries to control everything again. It's like he can't decide whether he wants me to grow up or stay his little boy forever. Maybe, Sarah suggested, he's struggling with the same contradiction you are. Maybe he wants you to be independent, but he's scared of what that means for his role in your life. If you don't need him anymore, who is he? Back inside the community center, Elvis was helping Edward confront similar fears about his changing relationship with Jake. The conversation had evolved from discussing their immediate conflict to exploring the deeper psychological dynamics that were driving their mutual frustration. Edward, Elvis said thoughtfully, Tell me about your biggest fear when it comes to Jake." Edward was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to examine. "I'm afraid that if I let him make his own mistakes, he'll get hurt in ways I could have prevented. But I'm also afraid that if I keep trying to protect him, he'll never learn to protect himself. And I'm afraid that when I die, he'll be alone in the world without the wisdom and experience he needs to navigate life's challenges. But mostly," Edward's voice broke slightly, "mostly I'm afraid he'll remember me as the old man who never believed in him, instead of the grandfather who loved him enough to worry." Elvis recognized the profound love underneath Edward's controlling behavior. This wasn't a power-hungry patriarch trying to dominate his grandson. This was a scared old man trying to prepare his only remaining family member for a world that had taken too much from both of them already. "What would happen?" Elvis asked gently. "If you told Jake exactly what you just told me, he'd probably think I was trying to manipulate him into feeling sorry for me. Or he might realize that your controlling behavior comes from love, not from lack of respect for his abilities." Jake finally worked up the courage to call his girlfriend Sarah. "We had another fight," he said without preamble when she answered. "A bad one this time. I think I really hurt him." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Your grandfather isn't going to be around forever. You know that, right? Whatever pride is keeping you two apart, is it really worth losing the only family you have left?" The words hit harder than Jake expected. He looked back at the community center, seeing his grandfather's silhouette through the window, talking to someone Jake couldn't quite make out. "I don't know how to talk to him anymore, Sarah. Every conversation turns into a lecture about respect and tradition, and how my generation doesn't understand anything." "Maybe," Sarah suggested carefully, "the problem isn't that you don't understand each other. Maybe the problem is that you understand each other too well, and you're both scared of admitting how much you need each other." Inside the center, Elvis was learning about the depth of Edward's fear. Not just fear of dying, though that was real enough, but fear of leaving Jake alone in the world without the tools and values that had sustained Edward through his own hardships. "I see him struggling with things I never had to face," Edward admitted. "Student loans that cost more than my first house. A job market that changes every 6 months. Social expectations that seem to shift like sand. And I want to help, but everything I know feels outdated." Elvis understood. He'd watched the world change dramatically during his own career, had struggled to adapt while staying true to his core values. "Maybe," he suggested, "the help Jake needs isn't advice about how to handle his problems. Maybe he just needs to know that someone believes he can handle them." Elvis made a decision that would change both their lives. "Mr. Thompson, would you do me a favor? Would you call Jake and ask him to come back inside? Tell him there's someone here who'd like to meet both of you." Edward hesitated. "He won't come. He's too angry." "Try anyway. Sometimes people surprise you when you give them the chance." The phone call was awkward, tense, filled with long pauses where neither man knew what to say. But something in Edward's voice, a vulnerability that Jake hadn't heard before, convinced him to turn around. 20 minutes later, Jake reluctantly walked back through the community center doors, his expression guarded but curious. He stopped short when he saw Elvis sitting with his grandfather, both men rising to greet him. "Jake," Edward said carefully, "I'd like you to meet Elvis Presley." "Elvis, this is my grandson Jake Thompson." Jake shook Elvis's hand, still processing the surreal situation. Hi, what are you doing here?" "Your grandfather and I were just having a conversation about music," Elvis replied with a warm smile. "He tells me you have quite a voice yourself." Jake's defensive walls went up immediately. "He told you that?" "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago." "Not that long," Edward interjected. "You're 25, son. You've got decades ahead of you to make music if you want to." The familiar tension began building again, but Elvis stepped in before it could explode. "You know what? Instead of talking about music, why don't we make some? There's a piano in the next room that's been sitting lonely all afternoon." What happened next would become one of the most transformative moments in both Edward and Jake's lives. Elvis led them to the community center's small piano, an old upright that had seen better days but still held its tune. "Jake," Elvis said, settling onto the piano bench. "Your grandfather tells me you used to know Amazing Graces pretty well. Think you still remember it?" Jake looked uncomfortable. "I don't really sing anymore." "Neither do I, officially," Edward said with a slight smile. "Doctor's orders are to avoid stress, and you know how nervous I get performing in front of people." Elvis began playing the opening chords, his fingers finding the familiar melody that had comforted millions throughout the years. "This isn't performing," he said gently. "This is just three men sharing something beautiful." Something magical happened when Jake began to sing. His voice, deeper now than it had been in high school, but still carrying the pure tone Edward remembered, filled the small room with warmth. Edward joined in on the harmony he'd taught Jake years earlier, their voices blending in a way that transcended their recent conflicts. Elvis provided the musical foundation, but more importantly, he provided the safe space where two proud men could meet each other without their defensive walls. As they sang, he watched their body language change. Edward's rigid posture softened. Jake's clenched fists relaxed. When the song ended, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. "I forgot how much I missed that," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he'd been holding back for months. "I never forgot," Edward replied. "I just didn't know how to ask you to sing with me again without it turning into another argument about everything else." "You know," Elvis said, still seated at the piano, "I've seen a lot of families over the years, performed for 3 generations sometimes, watching grandparents and grandchildren sing along to the same songs. The music never changes, but the people do. And that's okay, as long as the love underneath stays the same." Edward looked at his grandson with new eyes. "Jake, I need to tell you something. All these months I've been criticizing your choices, trying to make you do things my way. It wasn't because I thought you were wrong. It was because I was scared of losing you the same way I lost your parents." Jake's throat tightened. "Grandpa, no, let me finish," Edward continued. "I see you pulling away, making your own life, and part of me is proud as hell. But another part of me is terrified that if I let you go, if I stop trying to guide you, you'll disappear completely. And I can't be alone again." The honesty in Edward's voice broke through Jake's defenses completely. "Grandpa, I was never pulling away from you. I was pulling away from feeling like nothing I did was good enough. Every choice I made, every plan I had, you had a better idea, or a reason why it wouldn't work. Because I've made so many mistakes," Edward said, his voice cracking. "I've watched good people make bad choices and pay for them for years. I wanted to save you from that pain. But you can't," Jake said gently. "And more importantly, you don't need to. You raised me right, Grandpa. You gave me the values and the strength I need to handle whatever comes. But you have to trust that and let me use them." Elvis watched this breakthrough with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen the power of music to heal before, but there was something especially moving about watching it work between 2 generations of the same family. For the next hour, Edward and Jake talked more honestly than they had in years. They shared memories of Jake's childhood, discussed Edward's health openly instead of dancing around it, and even made plans for Jake to help Edward organize his old sheet music collection. "You know," Jake said, helping Edward to his feet as they prepared to leave, "maybe we could start having Sunday morning music sessions again, like we used to." Edward's eyes lit up. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much." They walked toward the exit together, their argument from earlier seeming like ancient history. Elvis gathered his things, feeling satisfied that his impromptu intervention had helped heal a family rift. But as they reached the parking lot, disaster struck without warning. "Grandpa!" Jake's terrified scream cut through the peaceful evening as Edward suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed onto the asphalt. The emotional reconciliation, combined with the physical stress of the day's events, had triggered the heart episode that Edward's doctors had warned might come. Elvis rushed over as Jake dropped to his knees beside his grandfather, frantically pulling out his cell phone to call 911. Edward's face was gray, his breathing shallow and labored. "Stay with me, Grandpa," Jake pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please don't leave me now. We just figured this out." Elvis knelt beside them, using his experience from other medical emergencies to help Jake position Edward properly and keep him conscious while they waited for paramedics. But what struck him most was the raw terror in Jake's voice. Not just fear of losing his grandfather, but fear of losing him before they could make up for all the time they'd wasted fighting. "He's going to be okay," Elvis told Jake, though privately he was worried about Edward's color and breathing. "You're both going to be okay." The ambulance arrived within minutes, but as paramedics worked to stabilize Edward for transport, he grabbed Jake's hand with surprising strength. "The music," Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. "Promise me we'll keep making music." "I promise, Grandpa," Jake said, tears streaming down his face. "I promise." Riverside General Hospital's cardiac unit became the setting for the most important conversations of Jake's life. As Edward underwent emergency procedures, Jake sat in the waiting room with Elvis, who had insisted on staying throughout the crisis. "I almost lost him before I could tell him how much he means to me," Jake said, staring at the floor. "All those months of arguing about stupid things when I should have been grateful for every day I had with him." Elvis had seen this kind of crisis-induced clarity before. "What would you tell him if you could talk to him right now?" Jake thought for a long moment. "That I'm sorry. That I understand now why he held on so tight. He was scared of losing me the same way I was scared of losing him. We were both just afraid of being alone." The waiting room hours stretched endlessly. Jake called Sarah, who drove straight to the hospital and sat with them in supportive silence. Other families came and went, dealing with their own medical crises, but Elvis stayed, providing quiet comfort and practical help throughout the long night. Dr. Patricia Williams emerged from the cardiac unit at 3:17 a.m. with cautiously optimistic news. Edward had suffered a significant cardiac episode, but quick response had prevented permanent damage. He would need surgery and months of recovery, but he was stable and asking for Jake. When Edward was finally stable and conscious, Jake was the first person allowed into his room. The old man looked fragile among the hospital machinery, but his eyes were alert and focused on his grandson's face. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," Jake said, taking Edward's hand. "I'm sorry for all the fighting, for pulling away, for not understanding that everything you did came from love." Edward squeezed his grandson's hand. "I'm sorry too, son. Sorry for trying to hold you back when I should have been helping you move forward. Sorry for thinking that keeping you close meant keeping you the same." What followed was the conversation they'd needed to have for years. About Edward's fears of being forgotten, about Jake's need for independence, about how love between generations sometimes looks like letting go instead of holding on. "I don't want to lose our closeness," Edward said weakly. "But I don't want to lose you either by holding too tight." "You're not going to lose me," Jake assured him. "But you might gain a grandson who feels free enough to choose to be close to you instead of one who feels trapped into it." Elvis watched from the doorway as two men who had almost lost each other forever found their way to mutual understanding and respect. The cardiac crisis had been frightening, but it had also created the urgency they needed to break through years of accumulated resentment and miscommunication. Dr. Williams explained Edward's recovery plan: surgery to install a pacemaker, followed by 6 weeks of restricted activity and gradual rehabilitation. Jake immediately volunteered to take family leave from his job to help with Edward's care, but Edward surprised him. "Son," Edward said, his voice still weak but determined, "I appreciate that more than you know, but I don't want you putting your life on hold for me. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to stop doing to each other." Jake looked confused. "But you'll need help." "I want to help. And I want you to, but as my grandson, not as my caregiver. We'll figure out the practical stuff together, as partners, not as me making all the decisions or you sacrificing everything." It was a small moment, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship dynamic. For the first time, they were talking about Edward's needs without either man feeling like he had to give up his autonomy or independence. The recovery period that followed became an unexpected gift for both of them. Jake moved back into Edward's house temporarily, but as an adult choosing to help family, not as a dependent being controlled. Edward accepted help with daily tasks while still maintaining decision-making authority over his own life. They established new routines that honored both their needs. Jake helped with grocery shopping and meal preparation, but Edward retained control over menu choices and household management. Edward shared his medical information with Jake, but maintained his relationships with doctors independently. Most importantly, they resumed their musical tradition with new understanding. Sunday morning music sessions became a highlight of both their weeks, but now they included contemporary songs that Jake enjoyed alongside the traditional hymns Edward preferred. They learned from each other instead of trying to change each other. Elvis visited them several times during Edward's recovery, always bringing new songs to try and encouraging them to continue developing their musical partnership. He watched with satisfaction as their relationship transformed from one based on control and resistance to one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. "You two have figured out something that most families never learn," Elvis told them during one visit. "You've learned that love isn't about making someone be who you want them to be. It's about accepting who they are and finding ways to connect across the differences." 3 months after the cardiac episode, Edward returned to the community center for the first time since his collapse. But instead of coming as a visitor, he and Jake came as volunteers, offering to start an intergenerational music program for families dealing with communication challenges. Their first workshop attracted 12 families, ranging from grandparents struggling with teenage grandchildren to middle-aged parents dealing with elderly parents' changing needs. Edward and Jake shared their story honestly, including their mistakes and breakthroughs, and used music as a tool to help other families find common ground. The program grew quickly, with families traveling from across Memphis to participate in sessions that combined music therapy techniques with practical communication skills. Edward's health improved dramatically as he found new purpose in helping other families avoid the conflicts that had nearly destroyed his relationship with Jake. Jake discovered talents he'd never knew he had, developing skills in group facilitation and music therapy that eventually led to a career change. He enrolled in a counseling program with specialization in family therapy, using his experience with Edward as foundation for helping others navigate intergenerational relationships. Their story began to attract attention from social workers, family therapists, and gerontology specialists who were impressed by their practical approach to bridging generation gaps. Edward and Jake were invited to speak at conferences and training programs, sharing their insights about how families can maintain connection while respecting individual autonomy. The Community Center program evolved into the Thompson Family Harmony Initiative, a nonprofit organization that provided music-based family therapy services to underserved communities. Edward served as program coordinator until his death at age 78. While Jake became the organization's executive director. On Edward's 75th birthday, 3 years after their community center confrontation, Jake organized a surprise concert featuring all the families who had participated in their program. More than 200 people gathered to sing Amazing Grace together, the same song that had begun their reconciliation journey with Elvis. Edward's speech that night captured the essence of what they had learned together. "Jake taught me that loving someone doesn't mean trying to make them live your life over again. It means giving them the tools to live their own life well, then trusting them to use those tools." Jake's response was equally moving. "Grandpa taught me that accepting help doesn't mean giving up independence, and offering help doesn't require taking control. It means showing up for each other as equals, even when our roles and abilities change." Elvis, who had remained connected to their family throughout Edward's remaining years, attended the birthday celebration, and was deeply moved by the transformation he witnessed. Sometimes, he reflected in a later interview, "The most important music isn't the songs we sing, but the harmony we create in how we treat each other. Edward passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months before Jake's 30th birthday, but their relationship in those final years had become a model for how families can navigate the challenges of aging, changing needs, and evolving relationships without sacrificing love or respect. Jake continued the Thompson Family Harmony Initiative in Edward's memory, expanding it to serve families dealing with various intergenerational challenges including immigration, cultural adaptation, and caring for aging relatives while maintaining independence. The program's success attracted national attention, leading to research partnerships with universities studying family dynamics and aging. Jake's work contributed to new understanding of how music therapy can facilitate difficult family conversations and help people find common ground across generational divides. Today, 15 years after that explosive argument in the Memphis Community Center, Jake Thompson is recognized as a leading expert in intergenerational family therapy. He credits his grandfather Edward with teaching him that strength comes not from winning arguments, but from finding ways to understand and respect different perspectives. The community center where their reconciliation began now houses the Edward Thompson Memorial Music Room, where families continue to gather weekly to work through relationship challenges using the techniques Jake and Edward developed together. Their story serves as a reminder that family conflicts, no matter how entrenched or painful, can be transformed when people are willing to listen to each other with open hearts and find common ground in shared experiences like music, love, and the desire to maintain connection across the differences that make each generation unique. Their story serves as a reminder that family conflicts, no matter how entrenched or painful, can be transformed when people are willing to listen to each other with open hearts and find common ground in shared experiences like music, love, and the desire to maintain connection across the differences that make each generation unique. The Thompson Family Harmony Initiative's success prompted comprehensive academic research into music-based intergenerational therapy. Dr. Rebecca Chen at the University of Memphis conducted a 5-year study following 127 families who participated in the program, documenting remarkable improvements in family communication and relationship satisfaction. Families who completed the 6-month program showed significant improvement in reported communication quality and reduction in family conflict frequency. Most significantly, 89% of participants maintained improved relationships even 2 years after program completion, indicating that the changes were lasting rather than temporary. The research revealed specific mechanisms through which music facilitated family healing. When family members sang together, psychological assessments showed increased empathy and emotional regulation. The act of harmonizing created measurable foundations for improved emotional connection between generations. Dr. Chen's research also documented the unique advantages of music therapy over traditional family counseling approaches available in the 1970s. While conventional therapy required families to verbally process conflicts, music therapy allowed them to experience emotional connection before addressing underlying issues. This sequence proved crucial for families where verbal communication had become associated with conflict and frustration. The Thompson model attracted attention from family therapists and social workers throughout the American South. The Memphis Department of Social Services featured Edward and Jake's story in their quarterly newsletter, leading to program adaptations in Nashville, Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans. In rural Tennessee communities where professional mental health services were limited, trained volunteers used simplified versions of the Thompson approach in church basements and community halls. These programs helped bridge cultural gaps between older generations raised in agricultural communities and younger people moving toward urban employment opportunities. Social service agencies in other southern states began incorporating music activities into their family reunification programs, finding that musical activities helped rebuild trust and communication between parents and children who had been separated due to various family crises. The success of the Thompson approach created demand for specialized training in music-based family therapy. Jake worked with the University of Memphis to establish a certificate program for therapists, social workers, and healthcare providers interested in incorporating music into their family intervention work. The program's curriculum combined traditional family systems therapy with music therapy techniques, teaching practitioners how to use music as a tool for facilitating difficult conversations and rebuilding damaged relationships. Graduates of the program worked in hospitals, schools, senior centers, and private practice settings throughout the region.